The presidency of the United States did not sit above the system. Ford was not operating in a vacuum. He was operating in a system that he understood better than most, a system where pushing too far, asking too much, or forcing too much transparency too quickly could destabilize not just the presidency, but the institutions that underpinned it. Welcome back to Chasing Power. I'm Charles Denyer. This is part 4 of What the President Doesn't Know. Today, we turn to Gerald Ford, a man who did not try to fight the system, but instead came to understand its limits and chose to operate within them.
Welcome to Chasing Power, the path to Pennsylvania Avenue, a Charles Denyer Productions podcast.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The audacity of hope. America, you've vindicated that hope.
And we will make America great again.
Gerald Ford did not seek the presidency. He did not campaign for it, and in many ways did not expect it. He was appointed Vice President of the United States after Spiro Agnew's resignation, confirmed by Congress, and then elevated to the presidency after Richard Nixon stepped down.
Are you prepared to take the oath of office as President of the United States?
I am, sir.
If you will
Becoming
raise your
the
right
only
hand
president
and
in
repeat
American
after me.
history to take office
I, Gerald
without
Ford,
ever being elected to the presidency or the vice presidency. But to describe Gerald Ford as an outsider to power would be very misleading. Before arriving at the White House, Ford had spent nearly 25 years in Congress, rising to become House Minority Leader and building a reputation as a steady, disciplined, institutional figure who understood how Washington actually worked. He was not a revolutionary, and he was not an ideologue. He was something far more important in this context. He was a man who understood the system and knew how to operate within it. And critically, he had already intersected with the intelligence world in one of the most consequential investigations in American history. Ford had served on the Warren Commission following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, an experience that exposed him, however partially, to the complex and often opaque relationship between intelligence agencies, national security considerations, and what is ultimately shared with political leadership and the public. Ford even personally edited the final report's description of President Kennedy's wounds to more firmly support the single bullet theory, a move that solidified the official narrative but fueled decades of skepticism and also accusations that Ford had crossed the line from impartial investigator to active architect of the conclusion, shaping key language to ensure the findings aligned with a predetermined narrative rather than allowing the evidence to stand entirely on its own. While he may not have had Nixon's deep suspicion of the intelligence community, he was not walking in blindly. Publicly, Ford was often portrayed as something else entirely, a well-meaning but unremarkable figure, occasionally clumsy, prone to verbal missteps, and a physical stumble or two, such as slipping and falling down the stairs of Air Force One. He was essentially a man who lacked the intensity and strategic edge of his predecessor. The image stuck. It was simple, it was easy to understand, but it was also very incomplete. Because what Ford lacked in theatrical presence, he made up for in institutional awareness, and what he understood, perhaps more clearly than most presidents who came before or after him, was that the presidency of the United States did not sit above the system. It sat inside of it, and that the intelligence community was not simply an arm of executive power, but one of the most complex and powerful structures within it. What Ford encountered was not just secrecy, it was architecture, an intelligence system built on layers, compartments, and controlled disclosure, where information did not move freely upward, but instead moved selectively, filtered through people, processes, and priorities long before it ever reached the president's desk. And what Ford would come to understand was something more subtle and more consequential, as he was the first president to be briefed on what became known as the family jewels, a compiled record of some of the most controversial activities in CIA history, including domestic surveillance, covert action programs, and assassination plots. But even in that moment, often framed as a revelation, this was not an act of discovery in the traditional sense, because Gerald Ford was not uncovering the system. He was being shown a version of it. The material that the president saw had been assembled internally, curated, and elevated at a moment chosen, not by the president, but by the intelligence community itself, under pressure from external exposure and internal risk. And that distinction matters, because what Ford received was not the system in full. It was the system as it chose to present itself, and even that presentation did not reach him directly. It moved through intermediaries, through Henry Kissinger, who operated not just as an advisor, but as a gatekeeper, shaping what information reached the president, how it was framed, and when it was delivered, effectively controlling the mechanisms through which Ford could view the intelligence world. Which means Ford was not confronting a single entity. Rather, he was navigating an ecosystem, such as fragmented authorities, compartmentalized programs, distributed knowledge, and architecture designed not to lie, but to prevent total visibility. And when the Church Committee began to expose the scope of the intelligence activity, assassination plots, domestic surveillance, covert programs operating across multiple administrations, the shock was not simply in what was revealed, it was in how it had existed, not hidden, but never fully assembled. And that very realization that the system had not lied, but had instead filtered, distributed, and segmented knowledge in a way that prevented any single unified understanding may have been one of the most important lessons of Ford's presidency, because it meant that even when a president is informed, even when actions are authorized, even when oversight appears to exist, the full scope of what is being done may still remain just out of reach. Not because it is being deliberately concealed, but because the system itself is designed that way. And Gerald Ford understood that, which is why his presidency is not defined by confrontation, not at all, but by calculation. Nowhere is that more evident than in one of the most controversial decisions of his time in office, the pardon of Richard Nixon.
Have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Publicly, Ford framed the pardon as an act of national healing, arguing that the country needed to move forward rather than remain trapped in the legal and political fallout of Watergate. But the reaction was immediate and deeply skeptical, because to many, the pardon did not look like closure, it looked like protection. It raised questions that have never fully gone away. Questions about whether there had been an understanding, an agreement, or even an implicit deal made before Ford assumed the presidency. A quiet arrangement to shield Nixon from prosecution in exchange for a peaceful transfer of power. There has never been definitive proof of such a deal. Regardless, the perception of one has lingered for decades. And in the context of what Ford was navigating, the intelligence disclosures, the instability of the moment, the potential for deeper institutional exposure, the decisions take on a different dimension. Because Ford was not operating in a vacuum. He was operating in a system that he understood better than most, a system where pushing too far, asking too much, or forcing too much transparency too quickly could destabilize not just the presidency, but the institutions that underpinned it. Years later, Dick Cheney, who served as Ford's chief of staff, shared something with me in private conversations that cuts clearly through the surface-level perception of Ford and forces you to reconsider him entirely, not as a placeholder president or a transitional figure, but someone who understood far more than he ever let on. He told me very directly that Ford was no dummy, that he knew exactly where the bodies were buried. And that statement, more than anything else, reframes how we should understand his presidency, because it suggests that Ford's restraint was not born out of ignorance, uncertainty, or a lack of curiosity, but rather out of a quiet and deliberate awareness of how the system actually functioned beneath the surface. He understood enough to recognize the limits of what he could realistically access, enough to see the boundaries that were not meant to be crossed, and enough to grasp that this very fundamentally important view, that the intelligence community was not something a president could simply take control of, fully expose, or dismantle without triggering consequences that extended far beyond his administration. So, instead of pushing against the system in the ways others had, or would, Ford made a far more calculated and in many ways more practical decision. He chose to operate within it, applying structure where he could, such as signing Executive Order 11905 to prohibit political assassinations, strengthening oversight mechanisms, and beginning the long process of imposing formal boundaries on activities that had previously existed in a space of ambiguity. But even those actions, as significant as they were, revealed the central truth of his presidency. Because what Ford ultimately did was place rules on a system he could still not fully see, shaping behavior without ever fully controlling the underlying structure. Oversight, in that sense, did not eliminate uncertainty. It simply formalized it, giving it shape without removing it entirely. And even the investigations of the time, no matter how expansive or unprecedented, never produced a complete picture. Because in the world of intelligence, completeness is not something that is ever fully achieved. It is something that is approximated, and often only temporarily. Ford's presidency, then, does not illustrate a president locked in conflict with the intelligence community, attempting to expose or confront it head-on. Instead, it illustrates something quieter, and in many ways far more revealing. A president coming to terms with the limits of what he could realistically know, and making the conscious decision to operate within those limits rather than attempting to break them. Yes, Gerald Ford may have appeared unremarkable on the surface, lacking the intensity or force of personality that often defines presidential legacy. But in the context of this story, that restraint, that recognition of the system's boundaries was not a sign of weakness, it was clarity. Because Ford understood something very few presidents are willing to fully accept, that understanding the system does not mean you control it, and that seeing part of it, even from the highest office in the country, does not mean you are seeing all of it. And that may have been exactly what allowed him to navigate one of the most volatile periods in modern American political history without collapsing under it. Simply stated, President Ford would never go to war with an institution he neither fully controlled nor completely understood, and instead chose to work within its boundaries, preserving stability at a moment when the country could least afford another rupture between the presidency and the intelligence apparatus. That's where we end Part 4. In Part 5, we turn to Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer turned president, an outsider who came into office promising transparency, accountability, and a fundamental reset of trust between the American people and their government. Stay with us.
All opinions expressed are those of the host and do not reflect the official positions of any political organization, government agency, or private institution. This podcast is for news reporting, commentary, and criticism. We use excerpts, clips, and quotations from political events and other copyrighted works under the Fair Use Doctrine. All rights in those works remain with their respective owners. The views expressed are our own and do not represent any other entity.